Welcome to Sheth Marketing Academy. This lecture is on branding, not on branding about how do you architect the brand, how do you choose the name, how do you create a logo, a slogan, a jingle. This is more about how brands can be used or branding can be used to create a differential advantage. We have lots of literature about product differentiation, but we really don't have as much about brand differentiation, and that's the topic of my presentation in this lecture. What I plan to do is to give you a little background, but really get into the evolutionary trend as to how over time branding has been used for different purposes by companies and the industries. And again, I hope that you'll find it more interesting. So let me get going. The title of the presentation is Branding for Differential Advantage. First slide talks about product versus brand differentiation. We know a lot about product differentiation as a competitive advantage. In fact, we have a whole theory of monopolistic competition that was created around the concept of what's called differentiation, and primarily it was product differentiation. This theory challenged the traditional theory of perfect competition or oligopoly, and especially oligopoly theory, which says that in order for you to make monopoly rents or profits, you must have industry concentration, entry barriers, which is the oligopoly structure. 4 or 5 players control most of the capacity. But 2 economists did a lot of research and found that there are certain industries where even though nobody has a dominant market share, most of them are small companies similar to perfect competition. They don't have a scale advantage, but still they command monopoly rents or monopoly profits, which means there is an exception to the traditional theory that the only way you can make money is through scale or a volume advantage. Economies of scale, economies of scope. So this research spawned quite a lot into especially pharmaceutical industry, which of course each pharmaceutical company, by specializing in a certain therapeutic class or a certain discovery process, would get a patent right. And with that patent right, they will basically get a monopoly power for X number of years, whatever the number of years government has decided. That's the traditional thinking. Fast forward that now to the same phenomenon now with the smartphones. Again, you find that technology and inherent patents are key differentiators. It's more about the product literature and less about the brand literature. And hence, while we have a significant knowledge about product innovation, product differentiation, we have relatively limited knowledge about brand differentiation and brand innovation. We have some limited research on brand differentiation, but it is primarily in the commodity markets. In the agricultural days, when all commodities were otherwise standardized, how do you differentiate yourself in what otherwise we call it a commodity product essentially? And that is the topic what I will talk about. So here are a few exceptions in the commodity market. The most recent exception, of course, is in the water business, which is a free good, unbranded generally. It's a municipality water or a well water. And at the same time in that industry, Perrier, maybe 30 years ago, created a world-class brand and commanded enormous price difference and therefore a margin difference, creating a differential advantage like a monopolistic competition. Before that one, cooperatives have done quite a lot, combining all the farmers' capabilities either in milk and dairy products, like Wisconsin dairy products, for example, or Vermont dairy products, even California dairy products, or in the agricultural commodities like cranberry. So you have an Ocean Spray brand that is created to somehow take all of the cranberry produce of the producers as a producers cooperative and come out with a brand, and that brand has created a differential advantage for those farmers who are into that cooperative. My best example actually is out of India. There is a brand called Amul, A-M-U-L. India is a highly unbranded consumption, unorganized sector. And it's a milk cooperative. And they came out with a cooperative, branding it, tremendous marketing capability. Distribution arrangements were made. They dominate the milk business in the region where they are primarily the cooperative. They are becoming national. But then they successfully introduced under the same brand butter. They also have introduced ice cream, and they have been very successful. It is an icon brand out of India, for example, in what is otherwise a commodity business. And of course, we have all heard about Chiquita in the banana business, for example, Del Monte in the pineapple business, etc. But this is about the extent to which we really know about the brand differentiation, not branding, but brand differentiation. In other words, how do you use branding as a way of differentiating yourself? Product is basically the same, but you are primarily packaging, designing, promoting, etc., where the difference comes. Brands have been there for thousands of years. Branding is new. So we should not confuse branding from brands. For example, brands have been there among philosophers. Aristotle, Plato were great brand names. Brands were there among intellectuals in general. Brands were there among artists. We know sculptors and painters historically, time immemorial almost, since the dawn of the civilization essentially, or what we call the farming community, as opposed to hunter and gatherers. Now you basically have a farming community, a civilization where you are living with community where you are not related to each other somehow. Writers have had great brand names, not only poets or playwrights like Shakespeare, for example, but a lot of other people. Explorers have great brand names. Marco Polo comes in my mind, for example. More recently, inventors have been great brand creators. They have their own brand as great inventors of whatever they invented, especially during the Industrial Revolution and post-agricultural economy. We find similarly kings have great brands. Some kings were so famous in what they did, either through conquest. Alexander the Great comes in my mind in the Western culture. Similarly, in the Chinese dynasty, there were giant kings, and they were very humanistic at the same time, very powerful on the other hand, and they had a brand identity of their own. And of course, we all know pyramids, which has their own identity as an architectural wonder in the way it is constructed in Egypt under the pharaohs. The best brands even today are surprisingly religious or faith brands. In fact, I'm hoping to do another lecture separately just on that, as to why the most bonding that takes place with a brand name is with the religion brand, whether it's Hinduism religion and any branch of Hinduism, or whether in fact it is Buddhism, it is Judaism, or it's Christianity, or it's Islam religion. Makes no difference. And all of these sub-branches of all the religions, you can see this enormous loyalty, a sense of emotional bonding that takes place between the individual and the faith. And we are trying to research why does that happen, and how does the religion differentiate itself by properly branding that branch of religion. All religions have enormous rituals, regalias, for example, as we have it at the university at the commencement, cap and gown as we call it, for example. So what is it about that religious brands that even today, from time immemorial, people bond themselves to a level where they would be willing to give up their life, sacrifice anything for the sake of religion? So that is a branding mechanism also. However, branding itself is a relatively new professional practice, as well as in fact a new approach in terms of scientific approach to understanding the branding and how it is used. So let's look at the evolution of branding from a differential advantage viewpoint, where and how it began. What I have found is that so far there are 8 major applications of branding to create a differential advantage. And I will go over each one of them in some detail. For example, the first use of branding has been for quality assurance in the cattle industry. So let's go through that as one slide. Branding word itself comes from the cattle industry, where some cattle raisers, growers, actually began to brand physically, put a mark on the skin of the cattle to differentiate themselves. As the story goes, I'm told it was primarily to assure the genetic quality of that cattle. You don't know the genetic quality because you cannot do anything till after cattle is bought. Either you produce milk or meat out of it, and therefore how do you assure quality assurance that the genetic is healthy, if not actually exceptional in some fashion? And this happened primarily in the breeding mechanism, where the bulls of certain species would be producing cows that will produce more milk. Typical way, husbandry as it is called, animal husbandry, that's a literature. And that's where the word branding came in. And it became a key differential advantage because that particular bull or that particular cattle or whatever animal it is would be differentiated from other cattle and commanded higher demand, better price, etc. What is the key message out of this first application of branding? The key message is that the best place where you can create branding as a differential advantage is obviously where the whole market is unorganized, unbranded. And by the way, even today, my estimates are running that as much as 60, if not 65% of all products and services consumed in the marketplace are unbranded. Services, definitely we know, are lots of unbranded services. For example, from the barber to the lawyer to the housekeeping, anything industry you analyze it. It's just getting to be more and more branded and differentiated. But this has been true, for example, in all emerging markets in India, China, Brazil, etc. While China has become a lot more modernized, just like America more than 100 years ago, from agriculture to the industrial society, and consumers began to buy branded, packaged goods, products, appliances, for example, automobiles, they all had branding that came in, but the rest of the world still is unbranded consumption. So branding use for quality assurance seems to be in an unorganized sector where small mom and pop suppliers are there. The supply heterogeneity is enormous. There is no regulation, there is no quality assurance, and therefore consumer does not know what he will end up buying or what she will end up buying next time from the same vendor essentially. Quality varies enormously, and that's the targeting would be primarily unbranded products and services. And by the way, while majority dominant part is in emerging economies like Africa, Brazil, Latin America, Central America, etc. However, I do want to mention that there are segments like that in advanced economies which are still consuming unbranded products and services. So there is an opportunity there also. Second one is that focus on reliability. In this case, quality assurance through reliability and consistency is the key one. And the best example I can tell you is Toyota in general, and we know Toyota became the very reliable car, and therefore worldwide it took over leadership role against all of the local incumbent dominant manufacturers, whether it's, for example, in America like a General Motors, Ford, or whether it's in Australia or it is in Europe. But my example is only last year what I experienced. I went to the Tanzania, Kenya, typical safari places. And I was expecting there to have a Land Rover, which is always identified as the safari vehicle. 90+% I found that all of the Safari drivers were driving Toyota Safaris. So I asked the question, and uncannily, no exception, every driver told me that it's the reliability. Because in that hilly place, either in the vast deserts kind of an area, or in fact, for example, wild animal chasing, you want the safari vehicle, the van, to work again and again and again in all the climatic situations, etc. And they said, we buy Toyota more and more and not Land Rover and other competitors, primarily because of the reliability. Third one, mechanization is key. In other words, you cannot get that quality assurance unless it is mechanized. And of course, we learned that from Henry Ford and his assembly line principle, where some form of mechanization created a processes which could be replicable. In other words, I can produce one product after the other, so I get this scale advantage, and at the same time, in fact, I can have some sort of a consistency that comes about. So mechanization is the third point that comes about as a message that if you are serious about using branding for quality assurance in unbranded markets, these are the rules of the game that you should play with. And the last one is that one has to put quality process. So quality process gives a differential advantage while scale gives you the cost advantage. So I can have a low cost position through volume and a differentiation position through quality process and branding that goes with that quality process. And of course, we have all learned that 4 quality processes, which is primarily the TQM, Six Sigma, zero defect, just in time, which is a second process for inventory and supply chain. Third one, of course, is cycle time, shorter cycle times, faster productivity. And the fourth one is what's called mass customization, where you are able to actually have flexible manufacturing where the cost of producing a small bunch or a one unit is theoretically equal to cost of producing multiple units in what is called mass customization platforms. So if one can put these 4 together, then one can easily get the quality process going and at the same time has the volume advantage as well as personalization in the market through mass customization. Everything comes together, and therefore lean processes or lean operations has become now the major buzzword or major thinking in operations management as quality became in the 80s, for example. So its concept is beyond quality per se, it is quality plus everything else that I just talked about. So this is the first major use of branding primarily for quality assurance. Second use of branding has been ingredient differentiation. In other words, something in your product where you have a unique ingredient, and that is the one on which you would like to promote, position, market, anything we talk about in the branding literature. Again, it begins from the agricultural sector, especially with spices and ingredients in foods and recipes. But more modern examples are, as I mentioned, Perrier in water. But the better examples are Post-it notes. 3M company accidentally discovered the unstickiness of the Post-it notes, made it into a huge business success. It is that chemical ingredient and a recipe which is not duplicable by anybody, surprisingly. Nobody has been able to duplicate that. They have not only patents, but procedurally wise. In other words, tearing down, you cannot do it. It's much easier to tear down a mechanical product, an engineered product, but a chemistry is usually much harder to duplicate. And today, Post-it still dominates enormously. And the Post-it brand itself has its own value now, on top of the 3M company value by and large. And of course, the most famous example recently has been Intel Inside. In the computers, Intel as a chip maker was offering the chips, but nobody knew Intel by name except as an investor brand maybe, or technology people knew, customers of course knew, and they came out with this very clever campaign about Intel Inside to do the pull marketing, as we call it, and the branding of Intel became the differentiator against their competitors. In other words, the end customers would demand that in a computer made by HP or by Acer or by Dell, by anybody, makes no difference. And as you know, I don't know whether you know, but in a computer business, it is not the assembled computer, but lots of components are bought by people, especially value-added resellers and system integration people. And Intel's today biggest customer is not, surprisingly, any one of the computer manufacturers, but it is a wholesale distribution company called Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro is the largest distributor customer of, for example, both Microsoft and Intel, for whatever reason. So there are lots of examples similarly from the beer industry, the wine industry, the liquor industry, as well as I mentioned, agricultural and industrial raw materials, where you had that unique raw material for whatever reason you got it and you promoted that heavily, but not just in terms of a B2B selling and all that thing, but into a branding and make brand as your differentiator. So what are the key messages from this application? The one key message is that you must own or control the ingredient on which you are differentiating. You must have a secure supply over time and, of course, by definition, a monopoly position. Very similar to the monopoly position one gets through a patent. So this is a non-patent based, some sort of a raw material and ingredients security that's absolutely essential to sustain this use of branding as a differentiator, ingredient differentiator. And the second one is that one must learn to rapidly expand distribution. Once you have found this formula of success, it is very important that one expands enormously, both in value add with that ingredient, but also massive distribution system. You cannot be fussy about distribution, so it is pretty much accessibility becomes a key driver. Very similar to what Coca-Cola has learned with the bottled, soft drink essentially, and as it is true with bottled water, as we know nowadays. So rapid distribution. And how do you create a very rapid distribution? The best way to create, fastest way to create a rapid distribution, of course, is franchising. As we have seen with McDonald's, as we have seen with Kentucky Fried Chicken, as we have seen, in fact, with anybody else. I mean, there are all kinds of retail formats where franchising, especially pizza, for example, that comes in my mind right now, is enormously. You can go global very quickly, franchising system. Of course, you do have an alternative like Starbucks, which has refused to franchise, mostly company-owned stores. But again, when they go into foreign markets, they often have to be franchised to somebody who is of local ownership in some fashion. So this is the second use. The third use has been just a follow-on to recipe differentiation, which is not the ingredients but the way you put it together. Most of these examples you will find come from chemistry of some sort or the other, because it's in chemistry where mixing it and coming out with something that nobody can duplicate becomes your secret formula or your core competency. In flavors and fragrances, such as in cosmetics, for example, or in perfumes, this is the key competency. In wine, the same thing. You blend the different varieties and you come out with a bottled wine where you have that recipe. And of course, the best example is a secret formula of Coca-Cola, which, as the saying goes, Coca-Cola actually had in its early days before it what became, I guess, a banned substance, which is cocaine. And they were successfully able to replace that with caffeine and, of course, bottle and package so that you don't have to buy Coca-Cola at the point of purchase and consumption like a soda fountain where it began, but you can have it distributed all over the world. And, of course, Apple offers a similar one, an iPhone and an iPad. It's a recipe, putting together. I'm told that there's nothing really unique. Sony can do the same thing, but they didn't know how to put it together into something that is user-friendly, something that can be immediately intuitive almost. And as you know, when you get your iPad or iPhone, they don't give you printed instructions even. It is so intuitive. And I think it's a clever idea. In the cattle industry where branding began, by the way, another branding that also comes from the farmer market is Levi's jeans. Those were designed for the farmers, but construction workers eventually, where you needed a tough material that can withstand the weather, withstand the wear and tear, etc. And as you know, eventually it became a fashion brand. So from all these examples of people who have learned how to create recipes, what are the key messages? The key message is that take a solution perspective. It is not a product perspective, but it is a solution perspective, which is a customer viewpoint of what is the right way of putting everything together. And for example, in the case of iPhone and iPad, the competency is hardware and software put together. Intel is good in hardware, Microsoft in software, but putting it together is a real competency. So they have a three-pronged approach: hardware, software, and applications all come together in a way that's like magic pretty much. And similarly, vendor management is the second key message. If this is your branding strategy for creating a differential advantage, then you must make sure that you have a supplier management in place, usually vendor management of some sort. And of course, the latest incident about this vendor management on a global basis is the new generation of aircraft that Boeing has created, 787, what's called the Dreamliner, where you have the composite materials. It's very fuel efficient, and it's mid-size, long-range probably aircraft. It is a unique aircraft, and everybody who has experienced anything about the aircraft and the story about it simply says it's a marvel of technology. But the competency is to coordinate like a project management or what happens in the defense industry, clearly to put all the suppliers together through a common design, etc. So this is the third thing. Fourth evolutionary use of branding for differentiation has been more for trademark protection. And the example that comes in my mind is Disney cartoons. And they primarily made sure that trademark, because it may not be patentable even, but you can have trademark, and the trademark laws and copyright laws eventually are even tougher laws in many ways, from imitation, duplication, and therefore the damages you can earn from somebody who imitates and duplicates without authorization or paying royalty is very interesting. And Disney, as you know, has a wonderful set of characters, all the cartoons, starting with Mickey Mouse, but the whole portfolio of cartoons. And that's very key, and they're branded very, very well. And the Disney brand is one of the best brands in the world. In fact, each one of the cartoon characters has a great brand. More recently, of course, Sesame Street has done something very similar, where each character, a Muppet, has his or her own identity. Similarly, Scotchgard was a brand created by 3M, mostly protected by trademark. And therefore, these examples for the fourth use of branding for trademark protection, what are the messages? The key message that you learn is that invest in unique design, logo, or a mascot. Of course, Lego as a toy, children's toy, worldwide famous, is primarily because of its unique design. Unique resin from which they make those bricks, and you can put them and tear apart thousands and thousands of times. It doesn't have a wear out. There's a unique design which is very versatile in the sense that people can become very creative, do whatever they want to do. And of course, more recently has been Michelin in the tire business, where they have the tire mascot, an icon, an animated cartoon character created which looks like made from tire. So invest in unique design, logo or mascot is very key if you are serious about using branding for trademark protection. Second one is you must do ruthless enforcement, which means that protecting the turf is absolutely critical. We have probably very strong protection from the patent viewpoint, and we have intellectual property rights there. But the trademark and the branding side still does not have the level of expertise that one would expect, because it has been delegated to the ad agencies and not to the legal profession. So my advice is that from these case histories, what I learned, two messages is that you must have some unique design, logo, or a mascot. And similarly, you must have a ruthless enforcement of your trademark rights. So, and this is happening now in electronic publishing as we have seen it, especially with a major decision made in New York, a court, for example, where the author who gave rights to publish his books to a major publisher, somehow there is a loophole about electronic publishing, and he went ahead and published on his own. And so now the publishers have all become very strong about protecting through copyright laws as opposed to trademark laws. But to me, I meant the same thing. So it's trademark and copyright protections by and large. And publishers became very wise, surprisingly, in the 70s when people began to just duplicate chapters from the books, especially in college market, which was a very lucrative market for them. People began to duplicate pages, paragraphs, borrow them, rewrite them, whatever they did, and they came out very strong copyright laws. And I know as a publisher myself that copyright laws are so oppressive that any violation gets you into significant economic downside risk, essentially. And therefore, you prefer people do not violate copyright laws as much as they used to. And today with electronic publishing, that has become a very strong protective mechanism. So all publishers are engaged in a very strong copyright law protections by and large. So this is the fourth use. The fifth and a very big use of branding for differential advantage has been segmenting the market by the use of the brands and positioning them in a different way. The classic case around here is General Motors versus Henry Ford. As we talk about, Henry Ford had this famous saying, customers can have all the choice of colors so long as it is black. And he was criticized, which I don't agree, by the way, because he was looking primarily for volume and scale economy. And if he added even one color, let's say white color, he would have to actually put together so many parts into white color coordination versus the black color, for example, as well as, in fact, DuPont as a supplier of chemicals was not capable of corrosive chemicals because steel industry was not refined to a level. So I have all the reasons why Henry Ford did exactly what he did, and it's the right one. But in contrast, General Motors, and because of the acquisition nature of the company, had separate divisions: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. And they wanted to make sure that they don't compete against each other internally, that each division will actually cater to a separate segment in the market, and therefore in those segments they will compete with their competitors. And that's a very famous architecture they created. So if you take Cadillac as the luxury market, then Buick and Oldsmobile in the sort of the upper middle class affluent people. You had then the Chevrolet for the working class. And I'll just talk about the two extreme examples where Cadillac versus Chevrolet. The highest selling model in Chevrolet always used to be a station wagon because the working class people, middle class people, tended to take vacations by driving with children, and two kids and a dog was a famous thing. And that a great saying, see the USA in your Chevrolet, and was just a takeoff. Product was designed for family use. Secondly, positioning promotion was done for, in fact, not only going in the neighborhood, what we do with SUVs and minivans today. Also, in fact, suppliers were organized accordingly. I mean, everything was done uniquely, and there was nothing in common with Cadillac. Cadillac was designed not for family travel, but adult travel. They never made a station wagon. In fact, the only station wagon you could aspire is one you couldn't afford in the world, which means after you die, the funeral cars were all made by Cadillac. Interesting. They never advertised for many years on television. It was always a print advertisement. Very key difference. Working class people were much more television oriented in those days, whereas the rich people primarily went to Broadway shows, operas, etc., and they looked down on television as a medium of the upper socioeconomic class, and they read print material quite a lot. The advertisements itself, the content would be one full page. You see this beautiful, slick Cadillac, almost like a limousine. You see the man in a tuxedo. The woman is absolutely with fur coat and jewelry. Wealth is dripping through the page. No copy whatsoever, just a picture, and primarily a slogan like elegance or something like that, and that was it. You didn't have to communicate more than that. Very clear demarcation, and therefore one went into one segment, other went into the other segment, and the other brands like Buick, Oldsmobile came somewhere in the middle. Whirlpool and Kenmore. Kenmore is the largest brand of appliances, but made by Whirlpool. And what they came out was, in order to have product available like a washing machine and a dryer, supplying to Kenmore, they were like an OEM manufacturer, essential OEM manufacturer, supplier. They got the permission from Sears Roebuck, that owns Kenmore brand, to allow them to also distribute the washing machines, very similar ones, not too much difference, under Whirlpool brand name, so it can go into other distribution systems than Sears' own retail stores. At one time, they had as many as 18,000 dealers and wholesale distributors, maybe 30, 40, to manage the whole national footprint. And this two-brand strategy on the same product from the same factory gave them not only scale advantage, but also really a competitive segmentation advantage. Limited is a retailer, and I've talked about it quite a lot in my rule of three theory, for example. As a specialty retailer, Limited began with a segment in their mind, 18-year-old women, young, college educated, and modern, which means they want to work and have a career unlike their moms. They found that the segment is maturing. They've been moving along with that segment, but also they began to start something for the Limited Express for the teenager, Limited for men. They came out with another brand name called Learners and began to add multiple brands. So if you go to a shopping center, shopping mall, you will find that Limited brands are all next to each other. And of course, they recently bought Victoria's Secret. So separate brands for separate segments and markets is a very key approach to using branding for a differential advantage. So what are the messages? From this use of branding, the key message is consistency across all 4 P's of marketing: product, place, price, and promotion. They must be consistent, and that integration and consistency is the role of the brand manager, essentially, is very key. Second message is that each brand ought to be under a separate division. That's very important. So for example, in the case of General Motors, each division was a standalone profit center, or one would call a business unit. In the IT services, I found the same thing. While the corporate name is the brand name, they tend to create vertical markets. So same IT services for retailing would be different than from banking, for example, which will be different than from manufacturing, which will be different than whatever other industries they apply the same IT services, which is usually some sort of an enterprise application software of some sort. And I've seen the same thing, in fact, where you have in most packaged goods companies, which by the way I find most diversified companies are packaged goods companies. By mistake, we treat them as if they are in one industry. They don't compete against each other in the same manner. So for example, Nestle will compete with General Foods in coffee, but in tea the competition is going to be Lipton, which is owned by Unilever. Procter & Gamble may compete with Unilever, let's say in soaps and detergents, but Unilever has food products and P&G is almost existing in most food products. P&G has a coffee, which they compete with General Foods, but not with Unilever. So each product category has its own manufacturing. Like detergents, you cannot mix it with coffee in any way, and therefore you have to keep it apart and separate brand names by product classes, if not sub-product categories, is very key. So you have the detergents, laundry products on the one hand, soaps on the other hand, coffee on the third hand, etc. So those are the two key lessons in this fifth use of branding as a differential advantage. The sixth use is for enhancing corporate reputation. And this has become very recent phenomenon where corporate reputation was very important for the company, and they used a branding approach to differentiate themselves. Nordstrom has done this remarkably well by having exceptional service. It's a retailer in the premium category and has relatively done well, but that particular retail phenomenon is very, the whole competency is that unique differentiation you make on your sales and post-sale services. There are stories after stories where they take the product back with no receipt. They take back even products that they have never sold to the customer, but they take a customer perspective quite a lot, and there are legendary stories about hero worship level almost what the salespeople have done. Mayo Clinic in, for example, hospital and clinical services is a very, very well-known brand. Again, an icon brand in that field. In this case, the primary emphasis on multidisciplinary practice on which they differentiate and brand it accordingly. BMW in engineering, they use engineering as their competency and then brand the BMW to a level where they differentiate same engineering capabilities maybe at Mercedes-Benz, for example. It may be even with Audi, for example, but somehow BMW has got that unique position by properly branding and taking advantage of a competency and focus on that one. Singapore Airlines, same thing, extraordinary service for every little detail and having understanding and memory about each passenger's unique needs, requirements. So the cabin crew to the check-in people to the business lounges, everything you look at it, you can clearly see the feel and difference about Singapore Airlines. So in this use, what are the key messages? I find three messages. First one is that the best strategy here is to under-promise in the brand and over-deliver. So under-promise and over-deliver becomes absolutely the wow factor. So not only you satisfy the customer, delight the customer, but customers are exceptionally aesthetic about what you have done. Second thing is that you must integrate your operations. In other words, all different functional areas have to come together. And that's not easy in many, many industries. We have strong functional silos, and they're usually organized sequentially, like a workflow or a supply chain. In this particular, it says that you have to put a bubble around and create some form of an integration, which leads to the third competencies that you need, and that is that companies that have used branding to differentiate their corporate reputation generally have ended up investing a lot more in IT services. IT services become the integration glue, and you are able to have each function on a concurrent basis or simultaneously basis, what one will call a connected enterprise. Of course, with the SAP integration now, it is relatively easier. Oracle implementation, which you have enterprise resource planning, ERP, you have a supply management, and you have the CRM, customer relationship management, all coming together. But before those platforms came in, and now in the web technology, you can do even more, but IT investments are generally underspent and not spent from a branding as a differential advantage. There are two more areas. One is the lifestyle positioning or reflection. In other words, companies have found that there is a trend there where people are taking the brand but using it more for lifestyle reflection as opposed to its functional utility by and large. And of course, the most famous brand around it is Nike, and they've done a fantastic job of capturing that, linking to the lifestyle of the individual more so by the use of Nike. It's not just a athletic shoe, it is more than that kind of a notion. So in shoes and apparel, they've done a wonderful job. Whole Foods as a retailer has done a great job, in fact, in the organic foods, which is a new trend, a new lifestyle reflection. Trader Joe's, which is a predecessor to some extent, has done the same thing with healthy foods and healthy snacks, began in California, but it is all over the country now. So what are the key messages in this particular use of branding for a differential advantage? There are two. One is that watch out for the demographic dynamics. In other words, demographics are not static. They change over time. And we know 3-4 demographics are changing constantly in the US economy: aging of the population, working women households, increasing ethnic population, as well as decline of the middle class. So given those changes, if you are locked into one lifestyle, then the brand is not moving with the changes in the lifestyle. And the best example is one that in the 70s my students from University of Illinois did, which is the Playboy Magazine. Probably the best vision statement ever created by any CEO as a founder was obviously the founder of Playboy. He knew what it meant. This was in the late 50s. And interestingly, they did a fantastic job of getting that market identified, almost at a unique position. But eventually the same population that was reading as young adults began to get married, and therefore it became more like a tabletop magazine. It lost its uniqueness. They were not able to shift accordingly both the content, the editorial, as well as the centerfold pictures to go along with that one. While Playboy did somewhat better in the international market where you had the same phenomenon emerging, but overall Playboy has lost into the new lifestyle reflections where other magazines have come in, basically liberal lifestyles in some fashion. Great magazine, by the way. Hugh Hefner was a visionary. His daughter actually managed the company very well after they listed as a public company, for example. They paid almost $50,000 for a short story. Just wonderful articles were written by well-respected authors, and at the same time they are now struggling to survive. Second key message is that as a lifestyle reflection, the brand must be aspirational. It must actually energize the customer to look forward to something bigger and better in their life. Not an escape mechanism as much as somehow saying that it's possible. That's a very key aspirational message, and we have seen how that has been done by many sports categories, for example, some food categories even now, through celebrity endorsements. We actually have a lot of controversial thing going on about many of the diet companies where they are using the celebrities and claiming that you have a weight loss reduction in the process if you follow the regimen. And there is a government scrutiny whether this is really a genuine phenomenon or it's just an endorsement. So there's a little more regulation coming, but the phenomenon itself is very possible. So lifestyle reflection is the next use that I have seen for branding or use of branding for differential advantage. The last use of branding for differential advantage has been to create an asset value out of your physical assets, like a factory or a product. There is a whole company that has emerged from the 80s called Interbrand, and there is a second company called Brand Finance, and they do an independent valuation of a brand independent of their product. So for example, Coca-Cola brand itself has a valuation of $60-70 billion. In other words, if the brand was disassociated, separated from the soft drinks products that they offer under that brand, it has an independent valuation. So this is what we call an asset creation, or brand as an intangible value. It is used to be called goodwill at one time, but since the tax regulation changed in the way you have that listed on your balance sheet as an asset, when you buy a company, like when Time Warner Group bought AOL, they paid an enormous price for AOL, not for the subscribers, the revenue, and the profitability, but of the brand name AOL, because they wanted to go from the print media into the digital world. I was very pleased to find that among the top 30 brands in the Interbrand rating, now for the first time there is a non-profit organization or not-for-profit organization called United Way. Its brand has an enormous value. And I know I've always thought another not-for-profit organization, a membership organization called AARP, meant for retirees, became very prominent in the 80s. And I've always thought that AARP as a brand name, even though it is not-for-profit organization, has a value of its own. As would be the AAA, which is the one that in an emergency assistance, road assistance, you dial in, you are a member. These are all membership organizations in some fashion or the other. But the best use of creating asset value using branding has been in what I would call private brands. Not the store brands, but usually a retailer creates a separate brand, a different name than the store name, and ramps up that brand. Retailers usually do not manufacture, so they get a dedicated supplier to manufacture, but eventually you sell the brand and create a huge asset value. And by the way, if you take the brand valuations of Sears Roebuck, which otherwise has been struggling, the largest retailer icon has 12, 13 key brands such as Kenmore in appliances, which always dominated against GE and Whirlpool. So I can do the valuation. They have Craftsman tools. I can do the valuation again, Black & Decker. Using Black & Decker valuation and just having comparable numbers for market share, etc. Same thing, they have Lawnmower, which is also called Craftsman. So I can compare with Toro, which is the best-in-class lawnmower in this country. They have Sears brand of tires, and I can compare them for tire companies. And I did at one time relatively simple exercise, and I was surprised that the value of the brands of Sears almost exceeded $50 to $60 billion, independent of the retail merchandise operations. These brands could be liberated in many ways. So as a retailer, I can have a brilliant strategy of coming out by each product line a brand of my own, have dedicated manufacturer make it, ramping up after 4 or 5 years in my retail store, and then sell the brand, either to the manufacturer or at least liberate the brand so that it is distributed in other stores other than your own stores. Very clever strategy. In fact, we have been almost implementing this in a couple of retail companies right now, and I see taking a good traction. In fact, in the department store like Target and even Walmart now, they are creating separate brands by some celebrity person. Of course, we always had several. Martha Stewart had her own brand at one time. Kmart has somebody else at the same time. Sears had at one time. But I think nowadays Target and Walmart are becoming quite serious about creating brands of their own, and they are not Walmart brand but separate brands, and creating value accordingly. So what are the messages from all these experiences where brand is used to create an asset value? The first one is that the company itself must have a balance sheet mentality. That means the traditional way of looking at branding from an income statement, in other words, what is my revenue, what's my margin, how much am I spending in branding, branding as an expense, an annual expense, because that is how income statements are written. Here you treat brand as an investment, just like factory as an investment, just like buying a company as an investment. And you do the valuation not in terms of income, etc., but what is its exit value, similar to what private equity companies do. They buy at a certain price, restructure it or invest in it, and then see the valuation go up. And the best private equity, of course, is Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, which has done a wonderful job of buying brands which were languishing, such as Coca-Cola, from $3 to $4 billion valuation, seeing in decade almost $100 billion valuation, so they can buy the shares and they can sell the shares and make money in the differential time difference essentially. So brand as an asset. So you have to have a balance sheet mentality, which means that quarter by quarter performance is not what you look for. You look for long-term value creation about that brand. Second thing is that one needs to understand that quite often when you create brands for value creation, asset value creation, or a shareholder value creation, investor value creation, you must learn how to do spin-offs. Quite often many companies are forced to do spin-offs because the mix does not come out well from an analyst and an investment community viewpoint, especially institutional investors. So for example, Pepsi had to divest all of their fast food restaurants, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut for example, and Taco Bell, into a separate company called Yum Brands and listed it publicly. Similarly, Philip Morris was forced to divest the cigarette company which had bought through acquisitions Kraft Foods and other companies to actually spin out the Kraft Foods as a standalone. Right now this is happening with many pharmaceutical companies where the mix they have doesn't match very well. So the idea here is that rather than being forced upon by investors and sometimes by regulators, you have this as a proactive strategy. You are in the business to operationally create a brand, ramp up its growth and profitability, but at the end sell the brand to somebody else. You don't need to own it forever. And this is not the typical corporate mindset that I've found in companies after companies all over the world. Best example here is Embassy Suites. Holiday Inn, after it was bought by some British company, it is now called Intercontinental Hotel Group. They came out with the concept of Embassy Suites, which means it's basically like an apartment that you live in, even though you are there one night, 2 nights, etc. So you have a kitchen, a separate bedroom, a separate sitting area. And the concept just took off. And they were very smart to sell the whole idea to other investors before the market got crowded by competition. Others began to duplicate the same idea because of its success. So it's a embrace the spin-off and divestment approach to the whole thing. And the last one is that the culture of the company here has to have a mergers and acquisition mindset. Most companies that rely on branding for differential advantage usually are not as interested in inorganic growth, acquisitions, buying, as they are interested in creating their own brands. Here the culture is very different. So those are the 3 lessons that I think we can learn from branding used for creating valuation. So we have talked about almost 8 different approaches companies have used for different purposes over time. So where is the branding going next? And I've identified 7 new approaches. Some of them you already know, some of them are more recent. The first major use of branding now has been in nation branding. We always had city branding, state branding for tourism. But today nation branding is primarily positioning and repositioning the image the country has. Very large practice on a worldwide basis. Singapore, for example, is in the middle of another repositioning in 20 years. They are always ahead of the curve. With the rise of the emerging economies like China and India in their neighborhood, Singapore becomes a very strategic city now. Just like Vienna came after World War II and the emergence of Cold War as a common meeting place between 2 rivals. So in this case, Singapore becomes the place where the Chinese and the Indian bureaucrats, corporations can come together. So it's like small bird flying in the sky on the 2 wings of China and India. Absolutely incredible repositioning. China is very interested in repositioning because of its image. Given the communist legacy, people still do not trust China or Chinese products. So how do you somehow reposition China not only as an emerging superpower who will take over the world, but as somebody who is benevolent or as a soft power. It is admired. It's a massive repositioning that needs to be done for the China market. India has a similar one, has the old image of a country of roaming cows and snake charmers. And how do you show them that this country is also equally very modern and into the future? It is one of the leaders in space technology, for example, in military technologies in general, in IT services that we have already talked about, just goes on. And it has a very large pool of talented people. So how do you reposition and rebrand yourself in the process? This is a massive practice. Second one, equally exciting, is employer branding. As the advanced economies go from manufacturing to more and more services economy, one of the key competencies in service economy is talent acquisition and talent retention, which means it is not the customer or the client, but the employees that are a very critical asset that you need to acquire. And therefore, you have in all professional services enormous now interest in branding. I know Wipro, as one of the companies in IT services, actually is trying very hard to actually create a brand that will appeal to their employees, especially future employees. And of course, this is where Silicon Valley brands just dominate. Google, for example, Facebook now, for example, whatever the companies are. And therefore, employer branding is very key in professional services. Third area that is growing is personal branding. In other words, many politicians, many preachers, evangelical preachers, for example, and there are many individuals of any notoriety are now very interested, and there is a practice around creating a brand of themselves to differentiate themselves from everybody else. It's a very interesting, exciting practice, in my view, and we can talk about that one. The real key message there is going to be that for you to create a brand of your own, you need to very much have a good agent, as we have seen in Hollywood talent, or you get on the programs like American Idol, for example, and many of the national competitive programs where your talent is displayed on a wider, I would say, screen, on a wider scan than what you are able to do in your local community. And we have seen many sort of talented people, but in small towns suddenly becoming national celebrities. That's the next area which is emerging, which is celebrity branding. While it has been very popular, for example, in the Hollywood areas where studios made stars, and there are whole public relationship programs organized around promoting their stars, but actually, in fact, now we see celebrity chefs, ordinary chefs who have extraordinary recipes, suddenly becoming icons. And they command enormous prices for themselves as speakers, as demonstrators, creating their own recipes or whatever they do. Another major area that is emerging, and it's a very interesting practice. We don't know the exact mechanics of that practice, but I think it's very interesting and important area. The fifth emerging area where branding for differential advantage is going to become very important and very useful, I think, is for social media branding. In other words, social media is not just one channel of communication, but how do you exist into the social media community? And what's your identity there, which may not be necessarily the same as your identity some other place. And by the way, social media branding is not limited to personal individuals, but it is equally important for corporations now. So it may not be at the product level, but definitely at a corporate level is very important. And of course, the typical social media that we think about is Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The next area, and one that's more exciting for me personally, and my colleague and I are writing a paper on this one, is the concept of extended self. As you know, in consumer behavior, we have classic writings about how do you extend your self-image by linking it with your family, your neighbors, and your community. and all of the possessions that you have, which reflect that you belong to your family, you belong to your neighborhood, you belong to the community, and belong to a group of friends through material possessions or certain behaviors. This is becoming most exciting in the digital world, where people are going literally right now, millions of them every day, to a virtual sites like Second Life, where the same executive, a woman executive, comes home, but they immediately she logs on through the computer and becomes a farmer, milking cows, taking care of whatever the farming chores you do, and it is a very involved process. You are identifying with that another world. And I'm sure you've all seen the global movement about all of the modern technology heroes such as Star Wars characters, for example, and there are many other hi-fi, and people dress up and have costume competition. I have seen several of these events where I've been amazed. There may be like 1,000 people all dressed in these high-tech costumes, enormous commitment of time and resources and money, obviously. But they're into that character. So they're extending themselves into another world as their identification. And of course, the most interesting area is creating my own avatar. So I can have my own person created on the internet, and that person is an identity which may not be the same as my identity. So this whole area of extended self-branding in the digital world, I think, is a huge emerging area of interest in the branding literature. And last, but not in the sequence in many ways, but one that is getting a lot more interest and attention now, like nation branding, is stakeholder branding. In other words, are we branding primarily to appeal and motivate customers, or is branding equally important to other stakeholders of a company, or the brand for that matter, such as employees, where employer branding I already talked about. But what about suppliers? What about community? What about investors? These have been kept separately, but in many ways, each one of them is becoming a standalone practice and a discipline to understand the mechanics of how employees relate to the brand as a differential advantage as opposed to just customers. How suppliers relate to the brand as a differential advantage as opposed to buying or selling to somebody that doesn't have a brand identity of some sort. So these are the 7 areas that were identified. I'm sure there are many more areas out there. It's a growing field, which is why I have in the chart the message. From the humble beginnings of cattle and the jeans, branding has expanded to areas beyond our imagination. And absolutely, it's incredible when you look at the history, like everything in life, very humble beginnings, and suddenly you become bigger than life. So to summarize, while brands have existed for thousands of years, branding is a more recent professional practice as well as an emerging scientific discipline. Not brands, branding, 2 different things. We know a lot more about product differentiation than about brand differentiation. Branding for differential advantage began in the farmer market, as I just mentioned, with cattle and the jeans. It has come a long way to serve many purposes of differentiation. In other words, differentiating for different purposes. From ingredient and recipe differentiation, brands have been created to segment markets, protect trademarks and copyrights, enhance corporate regulation, to reflect personal lifestyles, create intangible assets both for institutions, non-profit or not-for-profit, such as universities, for example, such as the NGOs that we talked about, as well as for corporations. There are 7 new areas of branding for differentiation, and they include, as I mentioned, nation branding, employer branding, stakeholder branding, personal branding, celebrity branding, social media branding, and extended self branding. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. I know that it took me a lot of time and effort to put all this together, but this knowledge I think is very useful to synthesize into one lecture. Thank you very much.